All right, it seems really fitting that we got a nice dark day to do a little more discussion of Rembrandt. Welcome back. Thank you, Kate, again for that question. Here it is. Could you please comment on a contemporary of Velasquez, Rembrandt, especially given that this year is the 350th anniversary of his death, and any influence he, too, may have had on the Impressionist approach to painting, especially in his later years? I love Rembrandt's treatment of light and his ability to convey emotion. Thanks very much, Kate. Rembrandt is really does not figure much in Impressionist painting because Impressionist painting is painting from life. I mean, it's literally all the music is entirely there in this drawing forth of the music of the scene as it is before you. Rembrandt's an invented, he's an inventor of the first order, right? He's an imaginative painter, and so I hope this doesn't disappoint you, but I still thought it might be rather amusing in certain ways. I'm not an art historian. Everything I'm talking about is related to what I see with my eyes, and how paint works when you know that world. So, um, so don't take me for anything more than that. I don't plan unless somebody asks me to talk about any other painters in particular. I'm more interested in talking about the seeing part of painting and what students need to do to be able to power themselves up to be good, really good painters. However, some of this stuff is so evident in any case, and it is true that the person I studied with whom I spent the most productive time, R.H. Ives Gamble, was an imaginative painter, very much of the type, although not precisely the type, of Rembrandt. So let's see where this takes us. Let's have a few look at some pictures. And I'm going to try to do this in under 30 minutes. So you're looking already at whatever time it took me. As you're looking at this video, you can see it. His first teacher was this guy Swanenberg, or Swanenberg, and you can see immediately a certain element of what's characteristic of Rembrandt, and that is the dramatic, shining lights, sort of smack in the picture, glowing lights glowing out of the picture, and a certain self-made quality. And as Gamble said, you don't really escape your first teacher. It's very difficult. What did he say? A painter has a hard time escaping the influence of his very first teacher. So there's Swanenberg, and oh, by the way, the content of Swanenberg's stuff was very eerie, bizarre. These pictures, in both cases, are like end times or Judgment Day, and all sorts of devilish things are happening. I relate them to Bruegel for doing exactly the same thing. This is the war with the angels. Between the Satan and his angels and all that sort of stuff, as you read it in the scripture. So 40, 50 years earlier, Bruegel's doing this, and then Swanenberg picks it up as time goes by. Lastman is the person to which it would appear that he owes the most from the point of view of a look and an approach to drawing and that sort of thing. Although I would have to say that that's hard to sort of sort out without actually seeing these pictures in the flesh and seeing them ideally sort of side by side with Rembrandt's. But certain things about the way he draws really are showing up in this body right here. And I'm talking about the way he draws initially, that first wave of his drawing. But anyway, his second teacher was this guy named Lastman, and despite having spent, well, I shouldn't even say it that way. He spent something less, apparently around 6 months, and with the guy, and yet he's given an awful lot of credit for Rembrandt's evolution. In certain ways, it's visible, and in relation to light, it's not really what this guy does at all. That's really much more the Swanenberg thing. So here you can see plainly that look that we just had in our hands there, the Lastman look, that figure on the left of Tobit, and going back up again. There's the way the figure looks. You see the way the color is used, the way the drawing is made. It's pretty much the same kind of thing. As I said, the imaginative. This is an imaginative picture. These are early on in Rembrandt's career in his 20s, and he must have gotten a significantly early start. I haven't really dug into that, but you can see all the sorts of errors he's making. A full imaginative picture, cast of cast of thousands sort of thing, and yet he's making those typical mistakes of a young student. Head sizes don't appear right, and that sort of thing. Nothing unusual for a young student. This also is the one in the left is an example of the way Lastman would approach his imaginative work. And so it's basically what you might call a grisaille. It's basically a monochromatic drawing. Rubens did the same thing. Most imaginative painters do some version of this. And so these two are Rembrandts. And you can see him working up rather a lot of detail even as this phase. This one past the thumbnail, the simple thumbnail phase, which you see in the drawings I talked about last week. And then he goes on. So then he goes on. I showed portraits last week, so a lot of the portraits are, or I should say, the portraits are the better part of his survival in the middle of his life, the early middle part of his life. And he had a very particular look. I almost say a peculiar look, but it was, Rembrandt's look is what I would simply say is less objectively true than Velasquez. And because that question involved, the word, Kate brought up Velasquez's name, I thought it might be useful to compare them. But this looks objectively more accurate than this one does, right? And you'd have to take my word for it, or actually have to have drawn a fair amount to know what I'm talking about, maybe. But that is the case, and that really is indicative of the way Rembrandt approached things. And you almost want to use the word homemade when you talk about him. He's so much of what he does, he sits there with a model in front of him, but he seems to be working it out of his head significantly. And it's not unusual for an imaginative painter to be even doing that in a portrait. Rubens did it in portraits. Velasquez is really much more of a let's do what the eye shows us, draw it the way the eyes present it, and all that sort of thing kind of guy. Much more like the Meldrum thing, the conversation that we had multiple weeks ago. Again, you can see the same thing. A portrait on the left by Rembrandt, and one on the right, the Dwarf by Velasquez. And you can see this. There's a sense in the one on the right that it feels like it's actually literally there in space. And this one feels like a painting. It feels like the areas around it, there's funny soft edges. Things don't look quite right in terms of the space. And that's not characteristic of a person who's using his eyes and drawing relationally. So he's still drawing relationally. You have to make an imaginative painting, but even his portraits wind up being a little bit on the imaginative side, if you understand what I'm saying when I say that. I am flying through this, by the way. I really don't want to overdo this particular, the time thing in this particular group. Now, this is the one you see on the cigar boxes, right? The Dutch masters. Rembrandt got the job to do this group of guys, a guild, I guess, and I'd love to say a smoking guild. That's amusing to me. And so you can see what he's got as an interior. He's got a room. He's got a table. He's got people sitting at the table. And then I bring you I purposely bring you this one of his contemporaries. Well, younger than Rembrandt, is Vermeer. And you can easily see what Vermeer is doing again. And this is why the Boston School guys gravitated toward Velasquez and Vermeer, is because of simply the truth of these statements in so many different ways. So again, this is rather, the walls back here look like he threw them in out of his head. They really don't have a strong relational a connection with all the other elements of the picture. Even the table in the front looks forced and odd in multiple ways. So he clearly is not in the camp of somebody who's like Vermeer appears to be literally setting everything up like a still life. That is not what this guy is doing. He appears to have had an idea, probably from a sketch, a scribble, and meaning like a thumbnail. And then he literally had these guys in one at a time and drew them with the same sort of color scheme values for his faces and that sort of thing. And rather did it out of his head. And you will find that his perspective can be curious as heck sometimes. this isn't necessarily. I mean, he looks like he's got a view, an eye, a bird, a view where he's actually lower. I mean, it would appear that he's down here somewhere. His viewing point is down here, so there may be these guys may be up on a stage or whatever as he's looking at them. But still, it's very uneven with this. You look around this room here, and you feel like you understand the architecture. Those kinds of differences. I don't say this to pick on him. I'm just saying he's an imaginative painter, and when you're doing portraits significantly out of your head, you'll have those odd qualities. Doesn't take anything away from his expression, by the way, and that's really a great point that Kate makes. It really is kind of like, his strength. I mean, the guy is just flat as good as anybody at that, both facial expression and body expression. This language of the body of the we call that body language, yeah. And so, but look at this one here. This is interesting. This is the Night Watch, for which he's rightly most famous. And now I'm showing you a Velázquez up in the right, where you can see that they have just a tiny bit more in common here. Again, the lighting here looks unified. That's it all looks like he did it, with enough of the elements there that he could actually paint it, all those relationships correctly to each other. This one still does look like an imaginative painting. I mean, he's got what appears to be a significant light in the middle here. That's, where's that light coming from and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's one of the interesting things about this picture is he's making up the light. This doesn't in any way, to me, look like it was set up and because it lacks that unity of nature. Rembrandt's unity is Rembrandt's unity. People miss that, and it's one of the marvelous things about the guy. And it's if that's what's going on, that's if you're a imaginative painter, you better darn well figure that one out, huh? Now, the stuff for which he's most famous might be this group of paintings, the Christ-related stuff, and these are wonderfully dramatic bits. I mean, the guy was a dramatist. I like to use this phase of this conversation to say that he was an illustrator, right? As much as he was anything, he was an illustrator, and I'm not taking anything away from any other aspect of his work. But the first thing you would think of with his work isn't automatically design as much as storytelling, and by the way, these two pictures, I don't think either one of them are this cool. I think this is more like what you would expect to see in a Rembrandt. But still, it's imaginative work, storytelling, and with the idea, with a feeling for really a feeling for the subject, which he obviously his empathy toward the Christ figure and toward who I'm sure he took to be his own savior is significant. Now here's his teacher. This is again Lastman doing a similar thing, and I show you the Titian down below and the Velázquez over here to show you that both of these guys had much greater interest in silhouette per se as one thing, right? So and then the resultant patterning, where so much of what Rembrandt does and Lastman too is really minimizing the use of the idea of pattern, and the silhouette is less important and less toyed with, less engaged aesthetically. But nevertheless, this gives you an example of the imaginative figure, whereas this would have been a figure. You would have had a person there standing there and holding that pose and painting from life, and it looks like it's actually a well-seen figure from life. And so this would be an imaginative painting, and yet the figure's done from life. And so much of that's what he's doing too. Titian does seem to be making up these heads to some degree, nowhere near as much as Rembrandt does. But there's any number of parts of these things that look like, sometimes the costume, sometimes aspects, say, this arm, they look like they're done from life, like literally done from life. And Veronese does a similar kind of a thing. You don't really ever quite get that feeling with with Rembrandt. Again, this is the imaginative soul. He's again the illustrator. I had a woman tell me that having seen this one here, she just tears came into her eyes. This is the where the high priest at the time of Christ's birth sees the child and prophetically speaks about him, having waited his whole life. And I believe his phrase is, "Now I can die in peace." He's seen he's saying he's seen the Savior. He's seen the Messiah. And so it probably does not hurt to actually be a person of faith to appreciate that, to feel the poignancy. But he really brings it. He really, I mean, and then the mood, in this case too. This is the raising of Lazarus, and there's this. He's a good dramatist. Rembrandt is, isn't he? By the way, nice in this one here. There's some of them have more or less color. He's not really anything like a Vermeer when it comes to the use of color, but he's still pleasing. He gets to that point where he gets past browns, or at least he has enough really delightful color in his work to be very, very pleasing. So much of this, though, you can see this is still like almost a remnant of what's left over from the underpainting. And he frequently will do that, almost leaves it as an Alfred Hitchcock backdrop in one of his paintings. It's not intended to look precisely true or be fully engaged with this. But what an imagination to actually create that thing there, And I mean, unless you had something to look at, as you may have, by the way, but I wouldn't put it past Rembrandt to have made that stuff up. By the way, now, so this is one of those things, and I talked about it last week when I was talking about the portraits, the self-portraits early on, where this love of light shows up. And you can see it again here. I mean, he makes it up, but he's just got a love of light. And it isn't done like an impressionist, but there's a love of light. And it's real. You can't get out of it. I mean, frequently it feels like, where's that spotlight? Oh, yeah, here it is. Let us set that spotlight up in a brighter, so it's a little bit brighter. But what it does is it does create the drama. It creates a focus. You could say artificially creates a focus, but still it gives you a strong center of interest, which is precisely the need. So now, what I was saying before is that he's an imaginative painter, but more than imaginative painter in the simple sense of that word, like a lot of the 19th century guys, including you'd say Bouguereau. He's not a realist. He makes up his own figures. So I'm showing you now, and you can see it everywhere, but I'm showing you now what that kind of person is. I probably should have gone to the next video thing first. The next picture first. This is Rubens. This is Michelangelo. These are imaginative figures. This is his man figure, his female figure, whatever. He makes these things up. Rubens, the same thing. These are entirely imagined. He owns these figures in his mind. He makes figures any place, walking up and down the street. This is if you want to be an imaginative painter and paint out of your head and not have to piece pictures together the way Gamel did. Gamel literally would draw everything he did. And there's every indication that Jerome did too. Every single figure, he had a model stand there and he drew around the model, and then he, as I said, gridded up whatever, traced it onto the canvas, and then painted it up. Actually, frankly, that's the description that Reynolds gives in chapter 1 of their way of working, on those kinds of paintings back then, the imaginative work. But so this is Delacroix, and again, the imagined figure. And so this idea of draftsmanship, that these guys all are given credit for being great draftsmen, and draftsmanship is often tied to creating figures out of your head. Yet there's a draftsmanship that obviously, and much I'm talking now about what you see in Ingres and Degas, which is really a draftsmanship that's often significantly based on the ability to draw what you see with that same kind of interpretive power. So let's go back then. I'm going to just show you again Daumier up in the middle here. This is Goya, this is Daumier, and this is Millet. Millet said that he never painted figures from life. He said he didn't know how to do it, and he does a self-portrait, he does some other things like that, which appear to be from life. But it's a very interesting thing that once you're in that world of making stuff up, that is your world. It sort of owns you, and it's very difficult to go over there and start borrowing literal anything from the look of nature. So that's just interesting information that you might want to know. When people are making these kinds of figures up, they do go from very bizarre sort of interpretations. I've done it myself, so I know how funny it can get, where you're sort of there, but you're not there. And yet they're adequate for the purpose, all these people, all these different poses. Obviously he was in love with her. And by the way, this is memory-based. Everything's memory-based, but Millet would actually watch people out there and try to learn what they were doing. He would try to learn the back, for example, and he would do drawings of those things. Not necessarily with the figure in front of him. In fact, it sounds from what he's saying that he didn't do it with the figure in front of him. Certainly looks sometimes that he did. He did though. And here again is that light. Now back to that image by Swanenberg. Look at that. Look at this. Are we doing exactly? I mean, he couldn't get Swanenberg out of his head. Is what it looks like. It's swirling. There's lights with their swirling. Falling away of further swirling. But I love the here you're actually talking about a metaphor. If you want to call it a metaphor of life, it's fascinating. But it's the mind and the soul, right? This is called the philosopher, and here's this stairway winding up into his, into the hintermost parts of the consciousness or whatever, a la Gamble, shall we say. And then you have, but you have the woman at the hearth here, and the warm fire down here, right? You have the light, and the reaching for the light, understanding that idea. But all this stuff, isn't that a delightful? Again, like the Michelangelo that I showed you a few weeks ago of the captive slave. It's a metaphor, right? It's a very effective, if it's not actually a simile or whatever, but effectively in that category of doing a painting that actually suddenly, without even thinking about it, it represents an entire aspect of the nature of man, all just by itself. And I've said before that this one does too. I talked about it before, but I keep on laughing at this one because I had in a halfway state of a consciousness. I was in this room, and I found later on thinking about it, kept wondering what the heck it was, and I realized this is my nose and these are my eyes. And I was my consciousness was actually behind my eyes. I'm madness, right? And again, though, that's a lie. I mean, this could be a discussion of psychology, right? The human psychology and that the inner man and all the stuff related to that. Fascinating stuff. And so often people think of him as just a guy who just plowed through pain. And he looks like sometimes he's just hacking, but the guy has an intriguing mind. And again, we talk about this stuff in that poetic way, right? There's a version, there's an aspect of meaning that's in that category, right? When you're reaching for the elevated, and Rembrandt does it. He does it more than once. By the way, I wanted to show you N.C. Wyeth's work just with that in mind. Do you see the similar use of light, for example? I think this is a Birth of Christ kind of painting. And then again, the use of they love light, and N.C. Wyeth does all sorts of amusing things with the play of evening, of ghastly little lights. Here he's having somebody murdered. But just show you N.C. Wyeth for the fun of it, making some connections for you. But again, my perception with everything I see by N.C. Wyeth is that his figures are largely in and out of certain pictures, and some less more than others, but are largely made out of his imagination. The figures themselves are, and then of course the whole thing is worked up in his imagination, or I should say from imagination, not from settings. As Jerome would have set up, we'd have he had an architect actually draw all the lines in the building that he was going to paint until it was architecturally right, and then he would have it painted and would either have it or actually paint it himself very carefully. When I say have it, I mean Barg was one of the guys who actually worked under him and worked for Jerome. So again, the light, right? So the subject is the light, as what Gamble was saying about the Boston School guys. I'm not quite convinced that that's true, but I think the means is the light. With Rembrandt, the subject, rather you might say, is the light. Now this is the Christ at Emmaus. This is the moment at which Christ has been explaining to these guys how he had to die, and the entire background throughout Jewish history, through the Old Testament, so they would understand. And when as their eyes were open to what he was saying, they realized he was actually the guy talking to them. And again, I love that thing of bringing in the soul, if you want to put it that way, right? Not just the understanding, but the inner man. It's just fascinating the way he does this, whatever you want to call these symbols, if you want to call that symbolism. But look at the use of the lights. I mean, it just goes on and on as a delight. Who gets any more delight out of this? I would suggest to you that even Da Vinci didn't get as much fun out of it, any more fun out of it. But yet the guy's doing it from his imagination in an imaginative way. How useful it is for you to study light and do your painting, do your job, but set up pictures that have good light. And if you're going to be an imaginative painter, learn to do this. Learn to understand how light works. From experience. Now this is a whole different use of light, so I'm only showing this because Vermeer was more or less his contemporary. And this is much more of a modern, much more of a modern use of light, and it really does mean the light on the wall, not a storytelling light. So, but it's a different kind of poetry, isn't it? And this is much closer to the Impressionist poetry. Anything related to the, you could see why anything related to the Boston School would be coming from much more from here. The Boston School guys really were not imaginative painters. I don't think on any gay. I'm trying to think of a day they were. Yes, a couple of them did some mural type stuff for the Library of Congress, and that would have been imaginative work. And there's some pretty nice stuff, and I don't show it here. So, and the last one I want to show you is this one of the his the way he approaches this whole thing and does a sort of experimenting with light. These are, as I understand it, these are quite late pictures, and they really have some ghastly drawing in them. I mean, just like ludicrous drawing. And some of the stuff he does typically when he's going off sideways or when he's just putting heads down is he will either make the head way too big widthwise or cut off the brains, or he'll make the eyes too high or too low and these kinds of things. I mean, but he's in the process. He corrects. He virtually always corrects all that stuff. But I love the way he just doesn't mind. He'll explore, he'll experiment, he'll whatever. He can manage the rest. I mean, that's a certain kind of confidence, isn't it, that you'll love about Rembrandt. But yeah, it is about the light, isn't it? I mean, he really is using the light, but he's using it for storytelling very, very effectively to bring your attention to an area. It's much more incidental, if you want to put it that way, when Vermeer simply sets up a picture and the light is simply used well. This is the purpose of this light is like spotlight again to bring attention to a spot. This is very, very interesting. The observations about fingers and all that sort of thing. Again, though, what's funny about him is it reminds me in one little way of Titian, and that is that, and some other people as well that are imaginative, and that is that sometimes it's very obvious when he actually has something, he brings it in the room and then noodles it up, and it gets ahead of all the rest of the picture in terms of the development. Heads, hands, whatever. Here's this highly noodled area, and he always was in love with these trinkets, bric-a-brac, and he just worked them up like crazy. So there it is, Kate. I can't tell you I believe that would have been really particularly adequate, but it's the kind of fun that I get out of it, given my background. And I hope you enjoyed that, and please do like, comment, share, all the rest. Okay, there's Rembrandt.